Good morning, beautiful souls. I wanted to do an overview of the 39 books of the Protestant Old Testament, because what I'm trying to do this morning is pick out a book in the Bible that I'd like to do a deep dive into. I'd like to do a Bible study. So I'm picking out a book in the Bible, and I thought it would be interesting to share with you an overview of what each book of the Bible is about. So let's explore together this morning, shall we? 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. So here's a synopsis of the 39 books of the Old Testament. Genesis answers two big questions. How did God's relationship with the world begin, and where did the nation of Israel come from? Here's a fun fact about the book of Genesis. Most of the famous Bible stories you've heard about are probably found in the book of Genesis. This is where the stories of Adam and Eve come from, Cain and Abel, Noah and the Ark, the Tower of Babel, Abraham and Isaac, Jacob's Ladder, and Joseph's. Dolly Parton sings the song, Coat of Many Colors. All of these stories come from the book of Genesis. Exodus. God saves Israel from slavery in Egypt and then enters into a special relationship with them. Leviticus. God gives Israel instructions on how to worship him. Numbers. Israel fails to trust and obey God and wanders in the wilderness for 40 years. Now, the last book that Moses wrote, the first 5 books, was Deuteronomy. Moses gives the children of Israel instructions, in some ways a recap of the laws in Exodus through Numbers, for how to love and obey God in the promised land. And then Moses dies in the book of Exodus. Then, in the book of Joshua, the 6th book of the Bible, a new leader emerges, whose name is Joshua, and leads Israel to conquer the promised land. Then, when they're in the promised land, he parcels out all the territories to the 12 tribes of Israel. Nobody knows who the author of Joshua is. But here's a fun fact about the book of Joshua. You've probably heard a few fantastic stories from this book. The Battle of Jericho, the day that the sun stood still. Most of the action happens in the first half of the book. The last half of the book pretty much is about divvying up the real estate. Then we have the book of Judges. Israel enters a cycle of turning from God, falling captive to oppressive nations, calling out to God, and being rescued by leaders God sends their way, called Judges. Nobody knows the author of this book. Then, the 8th book of the Bible has to do with Ruth. That's a great love story. 2 widows lose everything and find hope in Israel, which leads to the birth of the future King David. Nobody knows the author of Ruth, but it is a great love story if you like to study a love story in depth. After the book of Ruth, we have 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel, Israel demands a king who turns out to be quite a disappointment. Nobody knows who the author of 1 Samuel is. In 2 Samuel, David, a man after God's own heart, becomes king of Israel. However, nobody knows the author of 2 Samuel. Interestingly enough, in 1 Kings, The kingdom of Israel has a time of peace and prosperity under King Solomon, but afterwards splits and two lines of kings turn away from God. Nobody knows the author of 1 Kings or 2 Kings. Both kingdoms ignore God and his prophets until they both fall captive to other world empires. The 13th book of the Bible and the 14th book of the Bible, 1 Chronicles and 2 Chronicles, the author was a woman named Ezra. This, in 1 Chronicles, this is a brief history of Israel from Adam to David, culminating with David commissioning the temple of God in Jerusalem. In 2 Chronicles, we read about David's son Solomon builds a temple, but after centuries of rejecting God, the Babylonians take the southern Israelites captive and destroy the temple. Now, you might remember the Bible story where Solomon gets all of his strength from his long hair. Oh no, that's Samson. Never mind. Strike that. We'll get to Samson in a minute. Then, after 1st and 2nd Chronicles, we have Ezra. Now, Ezra is the 15th book of the Bible. In this book, the Israelites rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, and a scribe named Ezra teaches the people to once again obey God's laws. In the book of Nehemiah, which is the 16th book of the Old Testament, the city of Jerusalem is in bad shape, so Nehemiah rebuilds the wall around the city. The author of Nehemiah is, of course, Nehemiah himself. In Esther, someone hatches a genocidal plot to bring about Israel's extinction, and Esther must face the empire to ask for help. The emperor to ask for help. I remember reading about that. A woman went before the emperor and asked, hey, look, can you help? Can you help the Israelites? And we read, I'm not going to tell you. You got to study it. So that's the book of Esther. Nobody knows who the author of the book of Esther is. Then, now I did do a Bible study on this book, the 18th book of the Bible. If you suffer from depression, if you're going through a lot of things that you don't understand why you're going through those things, this is a great book to study if you're trying to overcome, bad things that are happening in your life or depression. The book of Job, not Job, Job, J-O-B, is the 18th book of the Bible. Satan attacks a righteous man named Job, and Job and his friends argue about why terrible things are happening to him. Interestingly enough, nobody knows who wrote the book of Job, but that is a fantastic book to get inspiration from. Then, the 19th book is Psalms. This is a collection of 150 songs that Israel sang to God and to each other, kind of like a hymnal for the ancient Israelites. And David wrote a lot of these songs. Very good. A lot of inspiration in the book of Psalms. There's David wrote a lot of the Psalms, but there's a culmination of many people that were the author of the book of Psalms. In Proverbs, we read a collection of sayings written to help people make decisions that bring about justice. So if you're looking for a quote of the day, you might want to study Proverbs. Very, very good quotes, a lot of inspiration in that book. The author was Solomon, was the main author, but there were other wise men. It wasn't just Solomon. So it's a collection of authors, but mainly Solomon. just like in Psalms. It was mainly David, but it's a collection of authors, right? Then we have Ecclesiastes, that famous song, Turn, Turn, Turn. There's a time and a season for everything, right? That comes from the 21st book of the Bible, Ecclesiastes. This is a philosophical exploration of the meaning of life with a surprisingly nihilistic, in other words, that's a word that means a surprising holistic tone for the Bible. Again, the author of Ecclesiastes was Solomon. The 22nd book of the Bible is the Song of Solomon, which means Song of Songs, right? A love song or a collection of love songs celebrating love, desire, and marriage. So, if you're going to get married in the near future, or if you have a new lover in your life, the book of Psalms is a nice book to read. The author was traditionally Solomon, but it could have been written by Solomon or in the style of Solomon. We believe it's Solomon, but we're not quite sure about that. Then we have the books of prophecy in the Old Testament. So if you want to read about prophecies, you want to go to the 23rd book of the Bible, which is Isaiah. God sends the prophet Isaiah to warn Israel of future judgment, but also to tell them about the coming king and servant who will bear the sins of many. The author of Isaiah is, of course, the prophet Isaiah, and he does teach about the Lord's coming. Then we have Jeremiah. God sends a prophet to warn Israel about the coming Babylonian captivity, but the people don't take the news very well. The author of that book, Jeremiah, is the prophet Jeremiah himself. Then we have Lamentations. Lamentations is a collection of lamenting or crying, right? Crying about the fall of Jerusalem after the Babylonian attacks. Jeremiah was the author of Lamentations. Lamentations is the 25th book of the Bible. Lamentations means to cry. Then we have Ezekiel. God chooses a man to speak for him to Israel, to tell them the error of their ways and teach them justice. This is what Ezekiel is about. And this was written by the prophet Ezekiel. Then we have the 27th book of the Bible, Daniel. Daniel becomes a high-ranking wise man in the Babylonian and Persian empires, and his prophetic visions concerning Israel's future are told in the book of Daniel. And Daniel was the author of this book with other contributors. Then we have Hosea. Hosea is told to marry a prostitute who leaves him, and he must bring her back. A picture of God's relationship with Israel. The author of this book is Hosea. The 29th book of the Bible is Joel. God sends a plague of locusts to judge Israel, but his judgment on the surrounding nation is coming too. And this is what the book of Joel is about. Then, after the book of Joel, we have the book of Amos. Amos is a shepherd who preaches against the injustice of the northern kingdom of Israel. Amos wrote this book. Then we have the book of Obadiah. Obadiah warns the neighboring nation of Edom that they will be judged for plundering Jerusalem. That is the author of this book was Obadiah. Then we all know this story, Jonah. Book 32. A disobedient prophet runs from God, is swallowed by a great fish, then preaches God's message to the city of Nineveh. The author is Jonah. Then we have Micah. Micah confronts the leaders of Israel and Judah regarding their injustice and prophesies that one day the Lord himself will rule in perfect justice. The author of the 33rd book of the Bible, Micah, is Micah himself. Then we have Nahum. Nahum foretells of God's judgment on Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. The author of Nahum was Nahum himself. I was actually looking into studying the 35th book of the Bible, but I'm not quite sure yet, and it's only because I don't hear much preaching from this book, which is called the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk pleads with God to stop the injustice and violence in Judah, but is surprised to find that God will use even more violence and let the Babylonians be violent. And the author of this book was Habakkuk. Then we have Zephaniah. In Zephaniah we read that God warns that he will judge Israel and the surrounding nations, but also that he will restore them in peace and justice. The author of the book of Zephaniah was Zephaniah himself. Then, in the 37th book, Haggai, we read that the people have abandoned the work of restoring God's temple in Jerusalem, so Haggai takes them to task. Haggai himself is the author of this book. Then we have Zechariah. In this book, the prophet Zechariah calls Israel to return to God and records prophetic visions that show what's happening behind the scenes. And then the last book of the Old Testament is Malachi. God has been faithful to Israel, but they continue to live disconnected from him. So, God sends Malachi to call them out. So, that's what the Christian Protestant Old Testament. These are the books of the Bible. And I find this very interesting. And in the next video, I will give you a rundown of the New Testament.
All these things shall be added unto you. Amen.